The Everlasting Man, Part 10. Part 2, Chapter 2. The Riddles of the Gospel. To understand the nature of this chapter, it is necessary to recur to the nature of this book. The argument which is meant to be the backbone of the book is of the kind called the reductio ad absurdum. It suggests that the results of assuming the rationalist thesis are more irrational than ours. But to prove it, we must assume that thesis. Thus, in the first section, I often treated man as merely an animal, to show that the effect was more impossible than if he were treated as an angel. In this sense, in which it was necessary to treat man merely as an animal, it is necessary to treat Christ merely as a man. I have to suspend my own beliefs, which are much more positive, and assume this limitation even in order to remove it. I must try to imagine what would happen to a man who did really read the story of Christ as the story of a man, and even of a man of whom he had never heard before. And I wish to point out that a really impartial reading of that kind would lead, if not immediately to belief, at least to a bewilderment of which there is really no solution except in belief. In this chapter, for this reason, I shall bring in nothing of the spirit of my own creed. I shall exclude the very style of diction, even of lettering, which I should think fitting in speaking in my own person. I am speaking as an imaginary heathen human being, honestly, staring at the gospel story for the first time. Now, it is not all that easy to regard the New Testament as a New Testament. It is not at all easy to realize the good news as new. Both for good and evil, familiarity fills us with assumptions and associations, and no man of our civilization, whatever he thinks of our religion, can really read the thing as if he had never heard of it before. Of course, it is in any case utterly unhistorical to talk as if the New Testament were a neatly bound book that had fallen from heaven. It is simply the selection made by the authority of the Church from a mass of early Christian literature. But apart from any such question, there is a psychological difficulty in feeling the New Testament as new. There is a psychological difficulty in seeing those well-known words simply as they stand, and without going beyond what they intrinsically stand for. And this difficulty must indeed be very great, for the result of it is very curious. The result of it is that most modern critics and most current criticism, even popular criticism, makes a comment that is the exact reverse of the truth. It is so completely the reverse of the truth that one could almost suspect that they had never read the New Testament at all. We have all heard people say 100 times over, for they seem never to tire of saving it, that the Jesus of the New Testament is indeed a most merciful and humane lover of humanity, but that the Church has hidden this human character in repellent dogmas and stiffened it with ecclesiastical terrors, till it has taken on an inhuman character. This is, I venture to repeat, very nearly the reverse of the truth. The truth is that the image of Christ in the churches, that is almost entirely mild and merciful. It is the image of Christ in the Gospels that is a good many other things as well. The figure in the Gospels does indeed utter in words of almost heartbreaking beauty his pity for our broken hearts. But they are far from being the only sort of words that he utters. Nevertheless, they are almost the only kind of words that the Church in its popular imagery ever represents him as uttering. That popular imagery is inspired by a perfectly sound popular instinct. The mass of the poor are broken, and the mass of the people are poor. And for the mass of mankind, the main thing is to carry the conviction of the incredible compassion of God. But nobody with his eyes open can doubt that it is chiefly this idea of compassion that the popular machinery of the Church does seek to carry. The popular imagery carries a great deal to excess the sentiment of gentle Jesus, meek and mild. It is the first thing that the outsider feels and criticizes in a Pietà, or a shrine of the Sacred Heart. As I say, while the art may be insufficient, I am not sure that the instinct is unsound. In any case, there is something appalling, something that makes the blood run cold, in the idea of having a statue of Christ in wrath. There is something insupportable even to the imagination in the idea of turning the corner of a street or coming out of the spaces of a marketplace to meet the petrifying petrifaction of that figure as it turned upon a generation of vipers, or that face as it looked at the face of a hypocrite. The Church can reasonably be justified, therefore, if she turns the most merciful face or aspect towards men. But it is certainly the most merciful aspect that she does turn. And the point is here that it is very much more specially and exclusively merciful than any impression that could be formed by a man merely reading the New Testament for the first time. A man simply taking the words of the story as they stand would form quite another impression, an impression full of mystery and possibly of inconsistency, but certainly not merely an impression of mildness. It would be intensely interesting, but part of the interest would consist in its leaving a good deal to be guessed at or explained. It is full of sudden gestures evidently significant, except that we hardly know what they signify, of enigmatic silences, of ironical replies. The outbreaks of wrath, like the storms above our atmosphere, do not seem to break out exactly where we should expect them, but to follow some higher weather chart of their own. The Peter, whom popular church teaching presents, is very rightly the Peter to whom Christ said in forgiveness, "Feed my lambs." He is not the Peter upon whom Christ turned as if he were the devil, crying in that obscure wrath, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Christ lamented with nothing but love and pity over Jerusalem, which was to murder him. We do not know what strange spiritual atmosphere or spiritual insight led him to sink Bethsaida lower in the pit than Sodom. I am putting aside for the moment all questions of doctrinal inferences or expositions, orthodox or otherwise. I am simply imagining the effect on a man's mind if he really did do what these critics are always talking about doing. If he really did read the New Testament without reference to orthodoxy, and even without reference to doctrine, he would find a number of things which fit in far less than with the current unorthodoxy than they do with the current orthodoxy. He would find, for instance, that if there are any descriptions that deserve to be called realistic, they are precisely the descriptions of the supernatural. If there is one aspect of the New Testament Jesus in which he may be said to present himself eminently as a practical person, it is in the aspect of an exorcist. There is nothing meek and mild, there is nothing even in the ordinary sense mystical about the tone of the voice that says, "Hold thy peace and come out of him." It is much more like the tone of a very businesslike lion tamer or a strong-minded doctor dealing with a homicidal maniac. But this is only a side issue for the sake of illustration. I am not now raising these controversies, but considering the case of the imaginary man from the moon, to whom the New Testament is new. Now, the first thing to note is that if we take it merely as a human story, it is in some ways a very strange story. I do not refer here to its tremendous and tragic culmination, or to any implications involving triumph in that tragedy. I do not refer to what is commonly called the miraculous element, for on that point philosophies vary, and modern philosophies very decidedly waver. Indeed, the educated Englishman of today may be said to have passed from an old fashion, in which he would not believe in any miracles unless they were ancient, and adopted a new fashion in which he will not believe in any miracles unless they are modern. He used to hold that miraculous cures stopped with the first Christians, and is now inclined to suspect that they began with the first Christian scientists. But I refer here rather specifically to unmiraculous and even to unnoticed and inconspicuous parts of the story. There are a great many things about it which nobody would have invented, for there are things that nobody has ever made any particular use of. Things which they were remarked at all have remained rather as puzzles. For instance, there is that long stretch of silence in the life of Christ up to the age of 30. It is of all silences the most immense and imaginatively impressive. But it is not of the sort of thing that anybody is particularly likely to invent in order to prove something. And nobody, so far as I know, has ever tried to prove anything in particular from it. It is impressive, but it is only impressive as a fact. There is nothing particularly obvious or obvious about it as a fable. The ordinary trend of hero worship in myth-making is much more likely to say the precise opposite. It is much more likely to say, as I believe some of the Gospels rejected by the Church do say, that Jesus displayed a divine precocity and began his mission at a miraculously early age. And there is indeed something strange in the thought that he who of all humanity needed least preparation seems to have had most. Whether it was some mode of the divine humility, or some truth of which we see the shadow of the longer domestic tutelage of the higher creatures of the earth, I do not propose to speculate. I mention it simply as an example of the sort of thing that does in any case give rise to speculations, quite apart from the recognized religious speculations. Now the whole story is full of these things, It is not by any means, as baldly presented in print, a story that it is easy to get to the bottom of. It is anything but what these people talk of as a simple gospel. Relatively speaking, it is the gospel that has the mysticism and the church that has the rationalism. As I should put it, of course, it is the gospel that the riddle of the church that is the answer. But whatever be the answer, the gospel as it stands is almost a book of riddles. First, a man reading the gospel saying he would not find platitudes. If he had read, even in the most respectful spirit, the majority of ancient philosophers and of modern moralists, he would appreciate the unique importance of saying that he did not find platitudes. It is more than can be said even of Plato. It is much more than can be said of Epictetus or Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Apollonius of Tyana. And it is immeasurably more that can be said of most of the agnostic moralists and the preachers of the ethical societies, with their songs of service and their religion of brotherhood. The morality of most moralists, ancient and modern, has been one solid and polished cataract of platitudes flowing forever and ever. That would certainly not be the impression of the imaginary independent outsider studying the New Testament. He would be conscious of nothing so commonplace, and in a sense of nothing so continuous as that stream. He would find a number of strange claims that might sound like the claim to be the brother of the sun and moon, a number of very startling pieces of advice, a number of stunning rebukes, a number of strangely beautiful stories. He would see some very gigantesque figures of speech about the impossibility of threading a needle with a camel, or the possibility of throwing a mountain into the sea. He would see a number of very daring simplifications of the difficulties of life, like the advice to shine upon everybody indifferently as does the sunshine, or not to worry about the future any more than the birds. He would find, on the other hand, some passages of almost impenetrable darkness, so far as he is concerned, such as the moral of the parable of the unjust steward. Some of these things might strike him as fables and some as truths, but none as truisms. For instance, he would not find the ordinary platitudes in favor of peace. He would find several paradoxes in favor of peace. He would find several ideals of non-resistance, which taken as they stand would be rather too pacific for any pacifist. And he would be told in one passage to treat a robber not with passive resistance, but rather with positive and enthusiastic encouragement, if the terms be taken literally, heaping upon gifts upon the man who had stolen goods. But he would not find a word of all that obvious rhetoric against war, which has filled countless books and odes and orations. Not a word about the wickedness of war, the wastefulness of war, the appalling scale of the slaughter in war, and all the rest of the familiar frenzy. Indeed, not a word about war at all. There is nothing that throws any particular light on Christ's attitude towards organized warfare, except that he seems to have been rather fond of Roman soldiers. Indeed, it is another perplexity, speaking from the same external and human standpoint, that he seems to have gotten on much better with Romans than he did with Jews. But the question here is a certain tone to be appreciated by merely reading a certain text, and we might give any number of instances of it. The statement that the meek shall inherit the earth is very far from being a meek statement. I mean, it is not meek in the ordinary sense of mild and moderate and inoffensive. To justify it, it would be necessary to go very deep into history and anticipate things undreamed of then, and by many unrealized even now, such as the way in which the mystical monks reclaimed the lands which the practical kings had lost. If it was a truth at all, it was because it was a prophecy, but certainly it was not a truth in the sense of a truism. The blessing upon the meek would seem to be a very violent statement, in the sense of doing violence to reason and probability. And with this we come to another important stage in the speculation. As a prophecy, it really was fulfilled, but it was only fulfilled long afterwards. The monasteries were the most practical and prosperous estates and experiments in reconstruction after the barbaric deluge. The meek really did inherit the earth, but nobody could have known anything of the sort at the time, unless indeed there was one who knew. Something of the same thing may be said about the incident of Martha and Mary, which has been interpreted in retrospect and from the inside by mystics of the Christian contemplative life. But it was not at all obvious view of it. The most moralist, ancient and modern, could be trusted to make a rush for the obvious. What torrents and effortless eloquence would have flowed from them to swell any slight superiority on the part of Martha? What splendid sermons about the joy of service and the gospel of work and the world left better than we found it, and generally all the 10,000 platitudes that can be uttered in favor of taking trouble by people who need take no trouble to utter them. If in Mary, the mystic and child of love, Christ was guarding the seed of something more subtle, who was likely to understand it at the time? Nobody else could have seen Claire and Catherine and Teresa shining above the little roof at Bethany. It is so in another way that in magnificent menace about bringing into the world a sword to sunder and divide. Nobody could have guessed that either how it could be fulfilled or how it could be justified. Indeed, some freethinkers are still so simple as to fall into the trap and be shocked at a phrase so deliberately defiant. They actually complain of the paradox for not being a platitude. But the point here is that if we could read the gospel reports as things as new as newspaper reports, they would puzzle us, perhaps terrify us much more than the same things as developed by historical Christianity. For instance, Christ, after a clear allusion to the eunuchs of Eastern courts, said there would be eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. If this does not mean the voluntary enthusiasm of virginity, it could only made to be mean something much more unnatural or uncouth. It is the historical religion that humanizes it for us by the experience of Franciscans or of Sisters of Mercy. The mere statement standing by itself might very well suggest a rather dehumanized atmosphere, the sinister and inhuman silence of the Asiatic harem and divan. This is but one instance out of scores, but the moral is that the Christ of the Gospel might actually seem more strange and terrible than the Christ of the Church. I am dwelling on the dark or dazzling or defiant or mysterious side of the Gospel words, not because they had obviously a more obvious and popular side, but because this is the answer to a common criticism on a vital point. The freethinker frequently says that Jesus of Nazareth was a man of his time, even if he was in advance of his time, and that we cannot accept his ethics as final for humanity. The freethinker then goes on to criticize his ethics, saying plausibly enough that men cannot turn the other cheek, or that they must take thought for the morrow, or that the self-denial is too ascetic, or the monogamy too severe. But the zealots and the legionnaires did not turn the other cheek any more than we do, if so much. The Jewish traders and the Roman tax-gatherers took thought for the morrow as much as we, if not more. We cannot pretend to be abandoning the morality of the past for one more suited to the present. It is certainly not the morality of another age, but it might be of another world. In short, we can say that these ideals are impossible in themselves. Exactly what we cannot say is that they are impossible for us. They are rather notably marked by a mysticism which, if it be a sort of madness, would always have struck the same sort of people as mad. Take, for instance, the case of marriage and the relations of the sexes. It might very well have been true that a Galilean teacher taught things natural to a Galilean environment, but it is not. It might rationally be expected that a man in the time of Tiberius would have advanced a view conditioned by the time of Tiberius, but he did not. What he advanced was something quite different, something very difficult, but something no more difficult now than it was then. When, for instance, Muhammad made his polygamous compromise, so that we may reasonably say that it was conditioned by a polygamous society. When he allowed a man 4 wives, he was really doing something suited to the circumstances, which might have been less suited to other circumstances. Nobody will pretend that the 4 wives were like the 4 winds, something seemingly a part of the order of nature. Nobody will say that the figure 4 was written forever in stars upon the sky. But neither will anyone say that the figure 4 is an inconceivable ideal, that it is beyond the power of the mind of man to count up to 4, or to count the number of his wives and see whether it amounts to 4. It is a practical compromise carrying with it the character of a particular society. If Muhammad had been born in Acton in the 19th century, we may well doubt whether he would instantly have filled that suburb with harems of 4 wives apiece. As he was born in Arabia in the 6th century, He did, in his conjugal arrangements, suggest the conditions of Arabia in the 6th century. But Christ, in his view of marriage, does not in the least suggest the conditions of Palestine of the 1st century. He does not suggest anything at all, except the sacramental view of marriage as developed long afterwards by the Catholic Church. It was quite as difficult to people then as for people now. It was much more puzzling to people then than to people now. Jews and Romans and Greeks did not believe, and did not even understand enough to disbelieve, the mystical idea that the man and the woman had become one sacramental substance. We may think it an incredible or impossible deal, but we cannot think it any more incredible or impossible than they would have thought it. In other words, whatever else is true, it is not true that the controversy has been altered by time. Whatever else is true, it is emphatically not true that the ideas of Jesus of Nazareth were suitable to his time, but are no longer suitable to our time. Exactly how suitable they were to his time is perhaps suggested in the end of his story. The same truth might be stated in another way, by saying that if the story be regarded as merely human and historical, it is extraordinary how very little there is in the recorded words of Christ that ties him at all to his own time. I do not mean the details of a period, which even a man of the period knows to be passing. I mean the fundamentals which even the wisest man often vaguely assumes to be eternal. For instance, Aristotle was perhaps the wisest and most wide-minded man who ever lived. He founded himself entirely upon fundamentals, which have been generally found to remain rational and solid through all social and historical changes. Still, he lived in a world in which it was thought as natural to have slaves as to have children, and therefore he did permit himself a serious recognition of the difference between slaves and freemen. Christ, as much as Aristotle, lived in a world that took slavery for granted. He did not particularly denounce slavery. He started a movement that could exist in a world with slavery. But he started a movement that could exist in a world without slavery. He never used a phrase that made his philosophy depend upon the very existence of the social order in which he lived. He spoke as one conscious that everything was ephemeral, including the things that Aristotle thought eternal. By that time the Roman Empire had come to be merely the orbis terrarum, another name for the world. But he never made his morality dependent on the existence of the Roman Empire, or even on the existence of the world. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. The truth is that when critics have spoken of the local limitations of the Galilean, it has always been a case of the local limitations of his critics. He did undoubtedly believe in certain things that one particular modern sect of materialists do not believe, but they were not things particularly peculiar to his time. It would be nearer the truth to say that the denial of them is quite peculiar to our time. Doubtless it would be nearer still to to the truth to say merely that a certain solemn social importance in the minority disbelieving them is peculiar to our time. He believed, for instance, in evil spirits, or in the psychic healing of bodily ills, but not because he was a Galilean born under Augustus. It is absurd to say that a man believed things because he was a Galilean under Augustus, when he might have believed the same things if he had been an Egyptian under Tutankhamun or an Indian under Genghis Khan. But with this general question of the philosophy of diabolism or of divine miracles, I deal elsewhere. It is enough to say that the materialists have to prove the impossibility of miracles against the testimony of all mankind, not against the prejudices of provincials in North Palestine under the first Roman emperors. What they have to prove, for the present argument, is the presence in the gospel of those particular prejudices, of those particular provincials. And humanly speaking, it is astonishingly little they can produce even to make a beginning of proving it. So it is in this case of the sacrament of marriage. We may not believe in sacraments, as we may not believe in spirits, but it is quite clear that Christ believed in this sacrament in his own way and not in any current or contemporary way. He certainly did not get his argument against divorce from Mosaic law or the Roman law or the habits of the Palestinian people. It would appear to his critics then exactly what it appears to his critics now, an arbitrary and transcendental dogma coming from nowhere, save in the sense of that it came from him. I am not at all concerned here to defend that dogma. The point here is that it is just as easy to defend it now as it was to defend it then. It is an ideal altogether outside of time, difficult at any period, impossible at no period. In other words, if anyone says it is what might be expected of a man walking about in that place in that period, we can quite fairly answer that it is much more like what we may be in the mysterious utterance of a being beyond man, as if he walked alive among men. I maintain, therefore, that a man reading the New Testament frankly and freshly would not get the impression of what is now often meant by a human Christ. The merely human Christ is a made-up figure, a piece of artificial selection, like the merely evolutionary man. Moreover, there have been too many of these human Christs found in the same story, just as there have been too many keys to mythology found in the same stories. 3 or 4 separate schools of rationalism have worked over the ground and produced 3 or 4 equally rational explanations of his life. The first rational explanation of his life was that he never lived, and this in turn gave an opportunity for 3 or 4 different explanations, as he was a sun myth or a corn myth, or of any kind of myth that is also a monomania. Then the idea that he was a divine being who did not exist gave place to the idea that he was a human being who did exist. In my youth, it was the fashion to say that he was merely an ethical teacher in the manner of the Essenes, who had apparently nothing very much to say that Hillel or 100 other Jews might not have said, as that it is a kindly thing to be kind, and an assistance to purification to be pure. Then somebody said he was a madman with a messianic delusion. Then others said he was indeed an original teacher because he cared about nothing but socialism, or, as others said, nothing but pacifism. Then a more grimly scientific character appeared who said that Jesus would never have been heard of at all except for his prophecies of the end of the world. He was important merely as a millenarian like Dr. Cumming, and created a provincial scare by announcing the exact date of the crack of doom. Among other variants on the same theme was the theory that he was a spiritual healer and nothing else, a view implied by Christian Science, which has really to expound a Christianity without the crucifixion in order to explain the curing of Peter's wife's mother or the daughter of a centurion. There is another theory that concentrates entirely on the business of diabolism and what it would call the contemporary superstition about demoniacs, as if Christ, like a young deacon taking his first orders, had got as far as exorcism and never got any further. Now, each of these explanations in itself seem to me singularly inadequate, but taken together they do suggest something of the very mystery which they miss. There must surely have been something not only mysterious, but many-sided about Christ, if so many smaller Christs can be carved out of him. If the Christian Scientist is satisfied with him as a spiritual healer, and the Christian Socialist is satisfied with him as a social reformer, so satisfied that they do not even expect him to be anything else, it looks as if he really covered rather more ground than they could be expected to expect. And it does seem to suggest that there might be more than the fancy in these other mysterious attributes of casting out devils or prophesying doom. Above all, would not such a new reader of the New Testament stumble over something that would startle him much more than it startles us? I have here more than once attempted the rather impossible task of reversing time and the historic method. For in fancy, looking forward to the facts, instead of backward through the memories, so I have imagined the monster that man might have seemed at first to the mere nature around him. We should have a worse shock if we really imagine the nature of Christ named for the first time. What should we feel as the first whisper of a certain suggestion about a certain man? Certainly it is not for us to blame anybody who should find that first wild whisper merely impious and insane. On the contrary, stumbling on that rock of scandal is the first step. Stark staring incredulity is a far more loyal tribute to that truth than a modernist metaphysic that would make it out merely a matter of degree. It were better to rend our robes with a great cry against blasphemy, like Caiaphas in the judgment, or to lay hold of the man as a maniac possessed of devils, like the kinsman in the crowd, rather than to stand stupidly debating 5 shades of pantheism in the presence of so catastrophic a claim. There is more of the wisdom that is won with surprise in any simple person, full of the sensitiveness of simplicity. Who should expect the grass to wither and the birds to drop dead out of the air, when a strolling carpenter's apprentice said calmly and almost carelessly, like one looking over his shoulder, "Before Abraham was, I am." Chapter 3. The Strangest Story in the World. In the last chapter I have deliberately stressed what it seems to be nowadays a neglected side of the New Testament story, but nobody will suppose, I imagine, that it is meant to obscure that side that may truly be called human. That Christ was and is the most merciful of judges and the most sympathetic of friends is a fact of considerably more importance in our own private lives than in anybody's historical speculation. But the purpose of this book is to point out that something unique has been swamped in cheap generalizations. And for that purpose it is relevant to insist that even what was most universal was also most original. For instance, we might take a topic which really is sympathetic to the modern mood, as the ascetic vocations recently referred to are not. The exaltation of childhood is something which we do really understand, but it was by no means a thing that was then in that sense understood. If we wanted an example of the originality of the Gospels, we could hardly take a stronger or more startling one. Nearly 2,000 years afterwards, we happen to find ourselves in a mood that really does feel the mystical charm of the child. We express it in romances and regrets about childhood, in Peter Pan or the Child's Garden of Verses, and we can say of the words of Christ, with so angry an anti-Christian as Swinburne, "No sign that ever was given to faithful or faithless eyes showed ever beyond clouds riven so clear a paradise." Earth's creeds may be 70 times 7, and blood have defiled each creed, but if such be the kingdom of heaven, it must be heaven indeed. But that paradise was not clear until Christianity had gradually cleared it. The pagan world, as such, would not have understood any such thing as a serious suggestion that a child is higher or holier than a man. It would have seemed like a suggestion that a tadpole is higher or holier than a frog. To the merely rationalistic mind, it would sound like saying that a bud must be more beautiful than a flower, or that an unripe apple must be better than the ripe one. In other words, this modern feeling is an entirely mystical feeling. It is quite as mystical as the cult of virginity. In fact, it is in the cult of virginity. But pagan antiquity had much more idea of the holiness of the virgin than of the holiness of the child. For various reasons we have come nowadays to venerate children, perhaps partly because we envy children for still doing what men used to do, such as play simple games and enjoy fairy tales. Over and above this, however, there is a great deal of real and subtle psychology in our appreciation of childhood. But if we turn it into a modern discovery, we must once more admit that the historical Jesus of Nazareth had already discovered it. 2,000 years too soon. There was certainly nothing in the world around him to help him to the discovery. Here Christ was indeed human, but more human than a human being was then likely to be. Peter Pan does not belong to the world of Pan, but to the world of Peter. Even in the matter of mere literary style, if we suppose ourselves thus sufficiently detached to look at it in that light, there is a curious quality to which no critic seems to have done justice. It had, among other things, a singular air of piling tower upon tower by the use of the a fortiori, making a pagoda of degrees like the seven heavens. I have already noted that almost inverted imaginative vision which pictured the impossible penance of the cities of the plain. There is perhaps nothing so perfect in all language or literature as the use of these 3 degrees in the parable of the lilies of the field, in which he seems first to take one small flower in his hand and note its simplicity and even its impotence, then suddenly expands it in flamboyant colors into all the palaces and pavilions full of a great name in national legend and national glory, and then, by yet a 3rd overturn, shrivels into nothing once more with a gesture as if flinging it away. And if God so clothes the grass that today is and tomorrow is cast into the oven, how much more? It is like the building of a good Babel tower by white magic in a moment, and in a movement of the hand, a tower heaved suddenly up to heaven, on top of which can be seen far off, higher than we had fancied possible, the figure of man, lifted by 3 infinities above all other things, on a starry ladder of light logic and swift imagination. Merely, in a sense, it would be more of a masterpiece than most of the masterpieces in the library. Yet it seems to have been uttered almost at random while a man might pull a flower. But merely in a literary sense also, this use of the comparative in several degrees has about it a quality which seems to me to hint of much higher things than the modern suggestion of the simple teachings of pastoral or communal ethics. There is really nothing that indicates a subtle, and in the sense true, a superior mind so much as this power of comparing a lower thing with a higher, and yet that higher with a higher still, and thinking on 3 planes at once. There is nothing that wants the rarest sort of wisdom so much as to see, let us say, that the citizen is higher than the slave, and yet that the soul is infinitely higher than the citizen or the city. It is not by any means a faculty that commonly belongs to these simplifiers of the Gospels, those who insist on what they call a simple morality, and others call a sentimental morality. It is not at all covered by those who are content to tell everybody to remain at peace. On the contrary, there is a very striking example of it in the apparent inconsistency between Christ's sayings about peace and about a sword. It is precisely this power which perceives that while a good peace is better than a good war, even a good war is better than a bad peace. These far-flung comparisons are nowhere so common as in the Gospels, and to me they suggest something very vast. So a thing solitary and solid, with the added dimension of depth or height, might tower over the flat creatures, living only on a plane. This quality of something that can only be called subtle and superior, something that is capable of long views and even of double meanings, is not noted here merely as a counterblast to the commonplace exaggerations of amiability and mild idealism. It is also to be noted in connection with the more tremendous truth touched upon at the end of last chapter. For this is the very last chapter that commonly goes with mere megalomania, especially such steep and staggering megalomania as might be involved in that claim. This quality can only be called an intellectual distinction, is not, of course, an evidence of divinity, but it is an evidence of a probable distaste for vulgar and vainglorious claims to divinity. A man of that sort, if he were only a man, would be the last man in the world to suffer from that intoxication by one notion from nowhere in particular, which is the mark of the self-deluding sensationalist in religion. Nor is it even avoided by denying that Christ did make this claim. Of no such man as that, of no other prophet or philosopher of the same intellectual order, would it even be possible to pretend that he had made it. Even if the Church had mistaken his meaning, it would still be true that no other historical tradition except the Church had ever even made the same mistake. Mohammedans did not misunderstand Muhammad and suppose he was Allah. Jews did not misinterpret Moses and identify him with Jehovah. Why was this claim alone exaggerated unless this alone was made? Even if Christianity was one vast universal blunder, it is still a blunder as solitary as the Incarnation. The purpose of these pages is to fix the falsity of a certain vague and vulgar assumptions. And we have here one of the most false. There is a sort of notion in the air everywhere that all the religions are equal because all the religious founders were rivals, and that they were all fighting for the same starry crown. It is quite false. The claim to that crown, or anything like that crown, is really so rare as to be unique. Muhammad did not make it any more than Micah or Malachi. Confucius did not make it any more than Plato or Marcus Aurelius. Buddha never said he was Brahma. Zoroaster no more claimed to be Ormuz than Ahriman. The truth is that in the common run of cases, it is just as we should expect it to be. In common sense, and certainly in Christian philosophy, it is exactly the other way. Normally speaking, the greater a man is, the less likely he is to make the very greatest claim. Outside the unique case we are considering, the only kind of man who ever does make that kind of claim is a very small man, a secretive or self-centered monomaniac. Nobody can imagine Aristotle claiming to be the father of gods and men, come down from the sky, though we might imagine some insane Roman emperor like Caligula claiming it for him, or probably for himself. Nobody can imagine Shakespeare talking as if he were literally divine, though we might imagine some crazy American crank finding it as a cryptogram in Shakespeare's works, or preferably in his own works. It is possible to find here and there human beings who make this supreme superhuman claim. It is possible to find them in lunatic asylums, in padded cells, possibly in straight waistcoats. But what is more important than their mere materialistic fate in our very materialistic society, under very crude and clumsy laws about lunacy, the type we know as tinged with this, or tending towards it, is a diseased and disproportionate type, narrow yet swollen and morbid to monstrosity. It is by rather an unlucky metaphor that we talk of a madman as cracked, for in a sense he is not cracked enough. He is cramped rather than cracked. There are not enough holes in his head to ventilate it. This impossibility of letting in daylight on a delusion does sometimes cover and conceal a delusion of divinity. It can be found not among the prophets and sages and founders of religion, but only among a low set of lunatics. But this is exactly where the argument becomes intensely interesting, because the argument proves too much. For nobody supposes that Jesus of Nazareth was that sort of person. No modern critic in his 5 wits think that the preacher of the Sermon on the Mount was a horrible half-witted imbecile that might be scrawling stars on the walls of a cell. No atheist or blasphemer believes that the author of the parable of the prodigal son was a monster with one-man idea, like a cyclops with one eye. Upon any possible historical criticism, he must be put higher in the scale of human beings than that. Yet all by analogy, we have really to put him there or else in the highest place of all. In fact, those who can really take it, as I here hypothetically take it, in a quite dry and detached spirit, having here a most curious and interesting human problem. It is so intensely interesting, considered as a human problem, that it is a spirit quite disinterested, so to speak, that I wish some of them had turned that intricate human problem into something like an intelligible human portrait. If Christ was simply a human character, he really was a highly complex and contradictory human character, for he combined exactly the two things that lie at the two extremes of human variation. He was exactly what the man with a delusion never is. He was wise. He was a good judge. What he said was always unexpected, but it was always unexpectedly magnanimous and often unexpectedly moderate. Take a thing like the point of the parable of the tares and the wheat. It had the quality that unites sanity and subtlety. It has not the simplicity of a madman. It has not even the simplicity of a fanatic. It might be uttered by a philosopher 100 years old, at the end of a century of utopias. Nothing could be less like this quality of seeing beyond and all round obvious things than the condition of the egomaniac with the one sensitive spot on his brain. I really do not see how these two characters could be convincingly combined, except in the astonishing way in which the Creed combines them. For until we reach the full acceptance of the fact as a fact, however marvelous, all mere approximations to it are actually further and further away from it. Divinity is great enough to be divine. It is great enough to call itself divine. But as humanity grows greater, it grows less and less likely to do so. God is God, as the Muslims say, but a great man knows he is not God, and the greater he is, the better he knows it. That is the paradox. Everything that is merely approaching to that point is merely receding from it. Socrates, the wisest man, knows that he knows nothing. A lunatic may think he is omniscient, and a fool may talk as if he were omniscient. But Christ is, in another sense, omniscient, if he only knows, and only knows that he knows. Even on a purely human and sympathetic side, therefore, the Jesus of the New Testament seems to me to have had a great many ways the note of something superhuman, that is, of something human and more than human. But there is another quality running through all his teachings which seem to me neglected in the most modern talk about them as teachings, and that is the persistent suggestion that he has not really come to teach. If there is one incident in the record that affects me personally as grandly and gloriously human, it is the incident of giving wine for the wedding feast. That is really human in the sense in which a whole crowd of prigs, having the appearance of human beings, can hardly be described as human. It rises superior to all superior persons. It is as human as Herrick and as democratic as Dickens. But even in that story there is something else that has the note of things not fully explained, and in a way here very relevant. I mean the first hesitation, not on any ground touching the nature of the miracle, but on that of the propriety of working any miracles at all, at least at that stage. My time has not yet come. What does that mean? At least it certainly meant a general plan or purpose in the mind with which certain things did or did not fit in. And if we leave out that solitary strategic plan, we not only leave out the point of the story, but the story. We often hear of Jesus of Nazareth as a wandering teacher, and there is a vital truth in that view, insofar as it emphasizes an attitude towards luxury and convention, which most respectable people would still regard as that of a vagabond. It is expressed in his own great saying about holes of the foxes and the nests of the birds, and, like many of his great sayings, it is felt at less powerful than it is, though the lack of appreciation of that great paradox, by which he spoke of his own humanity as in some way collectively and representatively human, calling himself simply the Son of Man, that is, in effect, calling himself simply man. It is fitting that the new man, or the second Adam, should repeat in so ringing a voice and with so arresting a gesture the great fact which came first in the original story, that man differs from the brutes by everything, even by deficiency, that he is in a sense less normal and even less native, a stranger upon the earth. It is well to speak of his wanderings in the sense that he shared the drifting life of the most homeless and hopeless of the poor. It is assuredly well to remember that he would quite certainly have been moved on by the police, and almost certainly arrested by the police for having no visible means of subsistence. For our law has it in turn of humor or a touch of fancy which Nero and Herod never happened to think of, that of actually punishing homeless people for not sleeping at home. But in another sense, the word wandering, as applied to his life, is a little misleading. As a matter of fact, a great many of the pagan sages, and not a few of the pagan sophists, might truly be described as wandering teachers. In some of them, their rambling journeys were not altogether without a parallel in their rambling remarks. Apollonius of Tyana, who figured in some fashionable cults as a sort of ideal philosopher, is represented as rambling as far as the Ganges and Ethiopia, more or less talking all the time. There was actually a school of philosophers called the Peripatetics, and even most of the great philosophers give us a vague impression of having very little to do except to walk and talk. The great conversations which give us glimpses of the great mind of Socrates or Buddha or even Confucius often seem to be parts of a never-ending picnic, and especially when is the important point, to have neither beginning nor end. Socrates did indeed find the conversation interrupted by the incident of his execution. But it is the whole point and the whole particular merit of the position of Socrates that death was only an interruption and an incident. We miss the real moral importance of the great philosopher if we miss that point. That he stares at the executioner with an innocent surprise and almost an innocent annoyance at finding anyone so unreasonable as to cut short a little conversation for the elucidation of truth. He is looking for truth and not looking for death. Death is but a stone in the road which can trip him up. His work in life is to wander on the roads of the world and talk about truth forever. Buddha, on the other hand, did arrest attention by one gesture. It was the gesture of renunciation, and therefore, in a sense, of denial. But by one dramatic negation he passed into a world of negation that was not dramatic, which he would not have been the first to insist was not dramatic. Here again we miss the particular moral importance of the great mystic if we do not see the distinction, that it was his whole point that he had done with drama, which consists of desire and struggle and generally of defeat and disappointment. He passes into peace and lives to instruct others how to pass into it. Henceforth his life is that of the ideal philosopher, certainly a far more really ideal philosopher than Apollonius of Tyana, but still a philosopher in the sense that it is not his business to do anything, but rather to explain everything. In his case, we might almost say, mildly and softly, to explore everything. For the messages are basically different. Christ said, "Seek first the kingdom, and all these things shall be added unto you." Buddha said, "Seek first the kingdom, and then you will need none of these things."